The Pharisees, Matthew 16. The Pharisees and Sadducees came to Jesus, so they found him. They were dealing with him at the beginning of chapter 15, and he kind of withdrew from them, and now they've caught up with him again somehow. The Pharisees and Sadducees. Now, the Sadducees haven't been seen that much so far. They're like the ruling party. They're the high priest is associated with them. They're the ruling class. The Pharisees are kind of like the class of the common people. And the Pharisees and Sadducees, they're both kind of like the self-appointed religious leaders of the people. The Sadducees being connected with the high priesthood, so they have a bit more of a claim to that actual title. Of course, by this point, the high priesthood is hopelessly corrupted. The Pharisees are just basically a self-made pressure group made up of various people from different professions. It kind of be like a runaway Rotary Club. If you think of a Rotary Club as being, people in a community who decide to just make a club to benefit the community, it's kind of the Pharisees are kind of like a crazy version of that almost. Just random people from various communities or synagogues who band together in their quest to pursue zealousness for the law. The Sadducees are the ruling party who are in charge of the temple and are connected to the priests. And they don't really like each other. They're lumped together a lot in the Gospels because they are united against Jesus, but they're not allies with each other. Like, they are enemies to each other. It'd be kind of like Republicans and Democrats who don't like each other, but will both team up to eliminate common threats that they both dislike. In our day and time, Republicans and Democrats both want to give away our money to Ukraine and Israel. So it's like they'll agree on that, and anybody who questions whether we should keep sending our money to Ukraine and Israel is an enemy. Okay, and the Republicans and Democrats can agree on being enemies, on the enemies. People who don't want to keep sending our money to Ukraine and Israel being enemies, but they won't agree on anything else. So the Pharisees and Sadducees came to Jesus and tested him by asking him to show them a sign from heaven. They already have done this. This is not the first time this has happened. We read about in Matthew 11, or chapter 12, 38, some of the Pharisees and teachers of the law said to him they want to see a sign. So they're still at, now he's been giving them lots of signs. They have had no shortage of signs to report, and because he's shown them. This is where the whole, self-inflicted spiritual blindness is coming from. They have seen signs. He has shown them signs. He replied, "When evening comes, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red, and in the morning, today it will be stormy, for the sky is red and overcast. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times," because they've been seeing the signs, and they just have been willfully ignoring them. "A wicked and adulterous generation looks for a miraculous sign, but none will be given it except the sign of Jonah." Jesus then left them and went away. Now, we already had an encounter very much like this a couple chapters ago, like I mentioned, at the end of chapter 12 of Matthew. This is basically the very similar conversation, just with a slightly different group of people approaching Jesus. There it was the Pharisees and teachers of the law, which would have been the scribes, the people in charge of writing the copies and stuff. Here is the Pharisees and Sadducees, which would be the main ruling religious parties of Israel. It also seems as though this is going to be the last time they really interact until Jesus goes to Jerusalem for that explosive final week. I think this is kind of put there to mark the moment when they stopped interacting outside of Jerusalem. When they went across the lake, the disciples forgot to take bread. Now, I read somewhere that the Greek word "forgot" there indicates willfulness. So they didn't. It might seem as though they just forgot to take bread, but the indication here is that they didn't think they needed to take bread because Jesus would just provide the bread for them. "Be careful," Jesus said to them. "Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees." So he's giving them a veiled warning. Now, yeast was a symbol of sin and corruption for the most part in their culture, because when you put yeast into a pan of bread, it will work its way off of the dough. They weren't allowed to put yeast in their bread during Passover or their religious feasts. They could eat it regularly. It's not like it itself was forbidden, like all the time, but there were occasions where they were not allowed to use it because it was forbidden from them, and it was often used as a symbol of something that kind of works its way through the entire whole, it works its way through the whole batch of dough. So something about the Pharisees and Sadducees you got to be careful against, because it will work its way all the way through you and corrupt you. But they don't know exactly what, okay? They're not entirely sure what he means by that. So they discussed this amongst themselves. And they said, it's because we didn't bring any bread. And again, from what I've read, that Greek word indicates that they intentionally didn't bring bread. I guess the thought here is that they just expected Jesus. They've already seen him do it twice. They just expected Jesus to provide the bread for them. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked, "You of little faith, why are you talking amongst yourselves about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Don't you remember the 5 loaves of the 5,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? Or the 7 loaves of the 4,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered?" So those are two separate incidents. They're not retellings of the same thing. 2 separate events. How is it you don't understand that I was not talking to you about bread, the kind of bread that you eat? Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Then they understood that he was not telling them to guard against the yeast used in bread, but against the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. The connection here seems to be that because the disciples themselves seem to have become a little too, expectant that Jesus will just provide bread for them, they're getting to they got to be careful, because that's what the Pharisees and Sadducees, like, they expect Jesus to do these things, to give them signs in this case. And the disciples have to be careful not to get into that mindset where they just expect Jesus to continue performing these miraculous signs, because that's just what he does. Like, Jesus has done these things. He has been performing signs. And the Pharisees and Sadducees have not been paying attention to them. They have not allowed those signs to teach them anything. And the disciples need to be careful not to get to that point where their hearts are hardened and they just expect Jesus to perform signs, like providing bread, without understanding what he's teaching them by doing so. So when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, this is a major deal here, this is a big event, so they finally got some alone time. He's been trying to kind of get away from the crowds for a couple of chapters now, and they finally managed to do it. They're up in the region of Caesarea Philippi, which is pretty far north. He asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist." We read about that when we talked about the inner discussions in the court of Herod. Others say Elijah, and that goes back to the whole idea that Elijah has to come. Now, Jesus has already identified John the Baptist as that figure. But that's where that is coming from. And still others, Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. I don't know where the idea of Jeremiah being brought back comes from, but these are just some of the things that people were saying, that the apostles were aware of, that people were saying at the time. "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" So he is the Son of Man he's talking about here. Who do people say the Son of Man is? Who do people say that I am? Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven." So he had the answer right. But even then, as we're going to read about immediately after, Peter is still not thinking in terms of that Jesus wants him to be thinking in. When he says Messiah, he's talking about the anointed one, he's talking about the king, and which is true, Jesus is going to be the king, but he's still thinking of it in terms of he's going to be the conquering king. He's going to come back and take his throne up in Jerusalem and be the ruler of the world. And I'm going to be right there with him. And we know this based on what happens immediately thereafter, as well as the behavior and statements of the apostles throughout the rest of the Gospels. We know that that's what they're thinking, and they will continue thinking that literally all the way up to the moment when Jesus goes back into heaven at the beginning of Acts. And so Son of Living God means this is the representative of God on earth, the one that he has chosen. That goes back to, for example, Psalm 2, which we read several times, that promise that oh boy, where are we here? The anointed one of God, in that case referring to the king. Because title Son of God often just meant the king, the rightful ruler. Psalm 2, why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth take their stand and the rulers gather together against the Lord and against his anointed one. Let us break their chains, they say. Lord meaning L-O-R-D, capital Lord. That means Yahweh, the name of Israel's God. Let us break their chains, they say, and throw off their fetters. But the one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord, lowercase L-O-R-D, so the master, scoffs at them. Then he rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy hill. I, the psalmist, will proclaim the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. You will rule them with an iron scepter. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. Therefore, you kings, be wise. Be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you be destroyed in your way. For his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. So that's what Peter is thinking of. And that is accurate. Jesus will do all these things, but Jesus is more than just that. But Peter isn't thinking that yet. He is thinking of Jesus in terms of Psalm 2, being the Son of God who is going to be anointed as the King in Zion, God's holy hill, and reign over the nations from Jerusalem, sitting on the throne of David. Which is true, okay, but that is not all. Oh my goodness, I just had this cat who is... Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, or Petros, which means rock. And on this rock I will build my church, my ecclesia, my congregation, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will have already been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Now we find out in the epistles and Revelation that Jesus is the one who really opens and closes doors. So the authority that Peter has here is derived from the authority that Jesus has in the first place. Then he warned his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Christ, because that again will invite opposition. We'll see plenty of that when we go to Jerusalem anyway. We don't need more opposition ahead of time. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and on the third day be raised to life. Peter, the same guy who just declared his confession of who Christ was, took him aside and began to rebuke him. Never, Lord, this must never happen to you. Jesus turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, adversary. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men. Just because Peter had the confession correctly doesn't mean he was actually in the same place Jesus was in terms of understanding what Jesus' mission actually was, because he didn't. And none of the other apostles did either, and we'll read about that as we read through the rest of the Gospels. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "If anyone would come after me, if anyone's going to be my disciple, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. What good would it be for a man if he gains the whole world, yet forfeits his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what he has done. I tell you the truth, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." Now that has a lot of different meanings, okay? That has a lot of different applications and fulfillments. But it basically means that the kingdom is going to be initiated soon. Now, part of it will happen in the next chapter, which we'll get to next time, about the Transfiguration. But Jesus will initiate his kingdom on the day of Pentecost, and the apostles will also be alive for that, and they'll be there to see that happen. That does not mean that some of them are going to live until Jesus comes back 2,000 plus years later. And it doesn't mean that also some people will tell you that the immediate and full fulfillment of that prophecy is the very next chapter of the Transfiguration, and that's not true. That might be a partial fulfillment, but that's not true. It's not accurate to say that fulfills that statement. It doesn't. There's more to it than that. But Jesus will establish his kingdom on the church, in the form of the church on earth, which he just talked about, and saying that the gates of hell are not going to overcome it. And the apostles will be there for that. And, the Son of Man comes, okay, well, no, he's not going to be physically present when that happens. But we have to understand that the Son of Man coming does not require him physically appearing on the scene when that happens. And we hear that and we think of the second coming of Christ, which will be a coming. Okay, that will be accurate to call it that, but it means a lot more than that. And that's what goes back to the day of the Lord, which we've already studied significantly, and we will continue to, but we have to understand the day of the Lord does not refer only to the last day in history. It does refer to that. That is a day of the Lord. Okay, that will be the ultimate one time for all time and the end of time day of the Lord, or the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. It's the same thing. When Jesus talks about the Son of Man coming in his kingdom, it's a different way of saying the day of the Lord is going to happen. And that does not require him physically to show up in the clouds riding on a chariot coming down to earth. That may happen someday in the future. That may be part of what happens on that great and final day. But the day of the Lord does not require that. It didn't require that in the Old Testament times. It didn't require that in the Roman-Judeo War when he came in judgment against Israel, and the destruction of the city and the temple. And it didn't require that in other instances throughout history where he comes in judgment on a nation. Stop that! I'm sorry. I gotta be done. Like, this cat is just going crazy.